We are now living in a new geological era, the Anthropocene, because of the unparalleled effects humans are having on the planet in which we live. And in this video, I want to talk about a couple of specific characteristics of this effect of humans are having on the planet, as well as talking about some of the changes. And we have long realized the effects that we've had on the planet. This picture is from Teddy Roosevelt visiting John Muir in Yosemite, California, and the creation of the very first national park in the United States. And this kind of typifies my understanding of how long people have worked to try to protect certain parts of their natural environment because of the value that they found within it. But this is something that goes far before 1903 when this photo was taken. I have a couple of other events in the lecture notes of going back in history, the number of different efforts of trying to protect the natural world. In 1783, the Qing dynasty declared Mongolia's Bogtakan Mountain a protected site. In 1832, in Hot Springs, Arkansas, it became the first U.S. national reservation. 1872, Yellowstone National Park was the first U.S. national park. In 1879, the New South Wales Premier established Royal National Park on the outskirts of Sydney. Absolutely beautiful area, very different than Yosemite, but still an amazing representation of Australian nature. In 1909, Sweden created Europe's first national park, the Sarek National Park, and the first Earth Day was in 1970, 52 years ago. And in those two videos that we just saw, we saw Maurice Strong in 72 looking a lot younger than he was in 1992. He was a former Canadian oilman, and he helped spearhead both of the conference's efforts to try to bring countries together to try to increase the protection of natural areas around the world. And even despite humanity's efforts to protect some of these areas, some of them are not completely impervious to the unanticipated effects of human behavior. And with that, it makes me think of Yosemite again. The fires in 2017 burned parts of Yosemite National Park and other surrounding areas. I have family that live outside of Paradise, California, in Oroville. And in those areas, they've seen a huge decrease in the water levels of their lakes nearby, and increasing frequency and intensity of forest fires, similar to what we saw in Australia in 2020. And this kind of brings me to the first element in understanding the Anthropocene, the humanity's depletion of resources due to their behavior over time. And I think this article from 2000 really shows the possibility of creative social science studies of humans' impact on the national environment. The link to the article is down below, but it shows the decline in forest cover in Europe from around 900 in the Common Era to around 1900. You see depletion of forest cover in Central Europe. And this is a trend that also applies in other parts of the world as well. You see here with the World Bank's latest data that I was able to find, you see a dramatic decline in forest area cover just from 1990 to 2016. The Amazon rainforest got a lot of attention and efforts to try to protect it back in the early 1990s, around the same time as the Rio Earth Summit. However, it has fallen off the headlines in recent decades. There were efforts to try to protect large swaths of Amazonian rainforest. But now with the latest government over the last couple years, there has been an escalation of deforestation in that region. And so you see a quite dramatic decline just within one lifetime of forest cover around the world, coinciding with better measures at actually getting a handle on how much forest we have around the world. So it's declined in Europe and it's declined around the world. However, where the existing forest levels are and the trends in different countries vary quite dramatically depending on countries' resources as well as their efforts to try to protect these forest resources. So you have here plotting a couple of countries that you might know something about their natural world. New Zealand, you actually see an increase from the 1990s to around 2000, leveling off there, of almost 40% of the country being forested area. The U.S., underneath that, which is still above the world average, so around 1/3 of the U.S. has that forested area. Of course, Alaska, Montana, large areas that are relatively low populated, contribute substantially to that forest cover. Of course, same with New Zealand and a bunch of other areas. You see Australia much lower at around 17%, and the UK even below that. And you can see a story of decreasing levels of forest cover over the longer time frame, but then also a leveling out, though slight increase with the increase in protected areas over time. And just as a number of square kilometers, you see the US's overall size is substantially bigger than New Zealand, and so you see the US has 3 million square kilometers of forested area, and New Zealand is down there with the UK, and Australia is in between. So the amount of forested area has declined, in part because of the needs of feeding growing populations of people around the world. And so you see the amount of arable land has increased, but as a percentage of area per person, it's actually decreased quite dramatically in the last 30 or 40 years. And I think that is a function of increasing technological advancements and increasing efficiency in growing the resources that we need to feed the world. And we're going to talk in later weeks about Malthusian versus Neo-Malthusian worries about how the world is going to be able to feed a growing amount of population. However, even with this decline in hectares per person, we are still able to feed large swaths of the world with a dramatically lower amount of people actually working on agricultural land. And so over time, as population has increased pretty much linearly in the last couple of decades, and we see now we're well over 7 billion people. We'll definitely hit over 8 billion people before the end of the decade. Population growth has grown quite dramatically in the two most populous countries in the world. In other countries, there's issues of declining population growth in Germany and in Japan, but in the most populous areas, you do see a growing population, though that growth has slowed over time as countries become more developed. But as a percentage of people actually who need to work the land in order to provide for people, that has declined hugely from 1400, and of course due to the Industrial Revolution in the last 2 centuries. And this is a graph of this decline over a longer swath of history. Most of the articles that we'll read in this class only looks at the last 50 or 60 years, sometimes only the last 20 years because of data availability. But as much as possible, I want to try to bring in those slower moving trajectories of human behavior to kind of show how things have really sped up over the last 150, 200 years because of the industrial and technological revolutions, and how this system just within a couple of lifespans have had to adapt to a dramatically different natural resource allocation and the demands put upon it by humans living within it. And so you see Poland going from roughly 60% of people working in agriculture around 1800 to 12%. That's the highest here, but you have in England a little over 1%. And you compare that also to Australia, you have well less than 5%, roughly 2.5% of the Australian population actually works in the agricultural sector. And the rest of the world is also trending down. In Africa, a lot of the cases that we're going to be talking about in this class do come from sub-Saharan Africa, in which only something like 4 to 6% of arable land is actually irrigated. But by and large, in other more developed countries, you see this predictable decline in the number of people working in agriculture. Burundi, of course, would be an example of a high level of agricultural employment, but in developed countries, that percentage is much lower. And you can see this in the US over this larger time span as well, in which you had this growth in people working in the labor force in the 19th century as the population grew and people moved out west. But then there was gradual concentration of agricultural production, and a number of people moved to more urban centers. And so you can see, the percentage of people working in agriculture is going down quite dramatically around the world. And there are still, of course, regional variations in that. You see, as I mentioned earlier before, Sub-Saharan Africa has a much higher percentage than Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, though this picture in 2019 might look quite different in 10 or 15 or 20 years. And I think that's the important issue to kind of anticipate what's likely to happen in the future. In some of these countries around the world, they're going to echo similar trends that we saw in Australia and the US, however, in a much more concentrated time frame. You see in the US that increase and then decrease, the Australian trend gradually down over the last couple of decades. I think you'll see a similar trend in these countries as they get more developed and better able to feed or expand corporates' ability to invest capital to be able to be most efficient in growing resources in these particular areas. And you see in China, I was able to find two maps that show population growth on the left and the distribution of arable land in China on the right. And what you see is the largest areas of agricultural production are also those areas in which you have a large amount of people living. And this ends up leading to increased urbanization, increased human impact on the world, that anthropogenic effect that makes us live in the Anthropocene. And I think all of us live with a fundamental understanding there is some impact of our day-to-day lives. If you've ever been out to the recycling center down in the southern part of the ACT, or to the dump there, or if in just pollution. Luckily in Canberra, I don't think I've ever seen smog since I've been here. I grew up in Los Angeles before they really brought in catalytic converters and unleaded gasoline. Whenever I visit Los Angeles, I haven't been there in a couple years, but the last time I was there, I was struck by how much clearer the air was than it was a couple of decades ago as technological advances exceeded the population growth in that particular area. China, you also see something similar, that you had a dramatic impact of human behavior on the environment and a gradual shift that has really escalated in recent years to deal with those effects. And so you can make, in linking back to week 2, economic arguments about what these movement of people from agricultural livelihoods on the land, in which their use of energy and their use of resources was dramatically less. As less people work on the land, they're more likely to go to urban centers, have more disposable income, easier to have more resources for heating, for refrigerating, for moving about, and that has an impact. There's been a couple of recent studies on the effect of resource depletion on China. A couple worth mentioning here: 60% of underground water is now considered pollution. Air and water pollution was estimated to cost between 3 and 6% of GDP in 2008. And in 2005, resource and environmental costs were estimated to have an even larger effect of over 13% on gross domestic product within the country. And air pollution contributed to 1.2 million premature deaths in China as of 2010. And so while a lot of this pollution was generated in order to to give us electricity, to give us heat and air conditioning, to allow us to drive cars, to get to our new jobs in urban centers, that has a cost on human security of the elements that we've talked about already over the last couple of weeks. And so I think China is an example of those dramatic costs, and it really is just hard to overstate the size, scale, and speed of the change in which that country has seen since opening up in 1989. It is just since that end of the Cold War, you've had a complete transformation of the economy and the relationship of people to their government and the expectations that people have of the kind of lives that they're going to have within their country, and with those kind of centralized planning organizations that make all that possible. They've also tried to take steps to try to prevent some of these economic costs from going forward in the future. And I can't think of any more dramatic visual of that than the installed solar capacity in China over the last couple of years. Just basically since I started teaching this class in, I think it was 2016, you've seen Chinese installed solar capacity go from around 10 gigawatts now to well over 200. And you see in the world itself, just in the last couple of years, a huge installed solar capacity around the world, and that would help prevent the kind of air and resource costs through coal-fired energy generation or other natural resources. And so we're at this kind of inflection point in which certain energy sources are becoming cheaper than others, and throughout human history, our reliance on certain resources, whether it's burning wood to be able to see, or candles, or burning coal for fire, within the last 20 or 30 years, we've really seen a dramatic realization of what those costs are for people around the world, as well as the development of policies, including subsidies and incentives for country citizens to adopt new means of trying to use energy sources that aren't as having an effect on this anthropogenic climate change. And so in this video, I just wanted to touch on two main elements of our effect on the world and how that's changed over the last century or two, with declining forest cover as well as agricultural employment. We in Australia are an agricultural powerhouse, but we still have far less than 5% of the country actually working in that. And it makes me think of the increasingly small percentage of people who have military experience, in which you have people tied to the land or tied to policy costs abroad, that have these experiences, that have the uncertainty and unpredictability of their livelihood depending on what other people do. And fewer people are dependent on those sources of income or those kind of livelihoods. And that could have potential political effects for how much countries feel pressured to work in a particular area or two. So I wanted to end with my first lecture question, because I would be interested in your take. What do you think either the decline in agricultural work or resource depletion has on the probability of civil war? This is the early stages at trying to look at environmental factors and how they shape those drivers of civil war we've talked about over the last couple of weeks. And we're going to be breaking it up into concrete chunks today as well as subsequent weeks. But before I do that, I want to get your take first from the very beginning to see whether you think these trends that I've showed you in this video might have indirect or direct effects on civil war. So for those students in my class, feel free to leave your comments on Waddle, and then we'll come back and we'll move on from the Anthropocene and start talking about anomalies, how these derivations from normal patterns and the overall decline in both forest cover, resource change around the world, what effect that is having on peoples on the ground.